Previously on Moya, I had hoped to drive over to the station again today, but with the storm as it was, I decided instead to sit tight and hope that Ashbridge would contact me here. Everything alright, Agent Nevin? You haven't been out in all this, have you? No, but I've just met a man who has in the car park here. Can you call the doctor for me? Who are you? Do you have a name? I'm sorry, I don't know a Lloyd Pryor. Is that your name? You didn't get anything out of him. Why has everyone until now told me that he'd been reassigned out of the system? And if he wasn't in an X sector, then where has he been all this time? I walked back to my motel room from the small office cabin. It was still bitterly cold out, but at least the wind had dropped and the snow had eased to a light fall. My mind was turning over so many questions that before I noticed my room, I had to double back a few steps to let myself in. Lloyd had been missing from I-42 for almost 5 years. Supposedly he had been forcefully reassigned to an X sector. However, I now knew that wasn't true. So where had he been for that period? If he could walk to the motel, it's likely that wherever it was in sector, and if that was the case, I was almost certain that the same people behind all 3 deaths were involved. Lloyd had also mentioned Robbie. Had he been with Robbie recently? I made my mind up on a course of action. The motel owner had mentioned that Robbie had worked in the General Records office. It was time to get my hands dirty. The tail end of the storm still clung to Moya by its fingertips, which meant there would be few, if any, people on the roads or around the administerial district. I took another look out of the small window, casting the light in my room out across the car park. The roads would not be easy going, but I'm sure my ministry car would be equipped to get me over there. I just need to take it easy. The administerial district was a simple drive, but cruising along the snow-filled roads was a tense affair. The snow filled the roads, and with no traffic, there were barely any other tread marks with which to navigate. The line between road and curb was blurred to such a degree that it took all my concentration to focus on keeping from mounting it on every turn. It really didn't help matters that I hadn't driven on manual for a long time. But there was no way I was trusting a computer to get me there in this weather. I had a slight unease with the whole system at the best of times. The streets of I-42 were normally quiet even in the daytime, but now, as late evening approached and the apocalyptic snowfall held Moya in its grip, the entire sector felt like a ghost town. Most lights in the small one-storey houses that lined the roads were out, and the entire journey was lit only by the soft orange glow of the streetlights that hung with the mist in the air, creating an infernal haze that draped itself over the soft landscape. It took me almost an hour to reach the administerial district. As my car crept through the empty streets, the fresh snow crunched loudly under the wheels. At least it was as I had expected. No one would have worked for at least the past 24 hours, and the district was deserted. I found the records office and drove past, instead choosing to park up around the corner on the edge of the next block. Despite the lack of people, I felt it would not behoove me to use the front door, and so, as I lifted the boot of the car, collecting a small flashlight and toolkit, I looked up and down the street for a side alley that might take me around the back of the building. As luck would have it, just opposite the parking bay lay an alley that disappeared into darkness in the direction of the register office, and so that, I figured, would be my best bet. I crossed over the street. The ground was so thick with snow that the air had a particular dead feeling to it, and sounds thudded into the soft surfaces, absorbed by the cold blanket. As I stepped into the narrow alleyway, the snow began to fall a little heavier, and I pulled up the collar of my coat around my cheeks. The walls on either side of the alley were tall and disorientating, but I headed back in the general direction of the small office building and found that eventually it opened out into a small square, surrounded on all sides by empty yards. A blue plaque, which signified a ministry postal box, sat next to the rear door of the two buildings in a row, leaving me with a 50-50 call. From behind, the small concrete buildings all looked identical, so I decided to take them on as I found them and passed the toolkit and flashlight through the bars of the rear gate of the building closest to me. I pulled myself up over the gate, my feet slipping on the frozen steel as they tried to instinctively find grip on the slippery metallic surface. With a dull clang, I rolled over the top and let myself fall onto the other side, collecting my tools from the motel room and crouching down into the shade of the low wall that divided each yard. I really wasn't sure how quiet I needed to be. Nothing had stirred since I'd left my motel room, and the yards were positively serene in the low light. Better to be safe than sorry. If I was found breaking into a ministry building late at night, my MIB badge and credentials would cover me in most normal cases, but I had abandoned all faith that I-42 was any normal district, and as it stood, I wasn't exactly sure who I could and could not trust out here on the edges of the outer districts, and that was as unnerving a thought as one might need in the middle of the night. Crouching down and keeping low, I shuffled along the wall and made my way slowly to the door. The blue plaque above the postbox confirmed that the building before me was the General Register Office, which simplified matters greatly. I let out a small sigh and opened the bag of tools, pulling the string that kept the small black wrap rolled up and let it fall, unravelling out and across the floor. It dawned on me at the same moment that I had not needed to use this kit since my training at the Bureau. A wave of nostalgia hit me as I flicked through the various instruments, and taking a second look at the lock sat in the centre of the small round knob, pulled out a pair of metal picks and shimmied up to the door, sliding the small L-shaped tension wrench into the barrel. I took out a sawtooth-like thin pick and raked at the lock slowly back and forth. The small clicking sound echoed around the yard in the quiet night, and I had to stop for a second and take a small breath to compose myself. Take your time, James. I raked again, slower this time, and pulled down on the tension wrench with a spare finger. The lock slipped and rotated with a gentle click. It's fortunate security is so low in the outer sectors. Pulling slowly on the handle to prevent any extra noise from the solid steel door, I opened it just enough to slip through and then closed it behind me with another soft click. I stood in the quiet office, unable to see anything in the pitch black. There were no windows and the rear storeroom was entirely lifeless, absent of even a low electrical hum that often accompanies everyday silences. I guessed that the power had been turned off as the staff had likely bet on a couple of days away from work, and I certainly wasn't going to go searching for the breaker. I flicked on the torch, keeping the beam low to the ground, and the room lit up in a soft white glow. It was filled with cabinets and metal shelving stacked boxes from the floor to the ceiling. Where do I even start here? After walking up and down the shelving once or twice and managing a certain degree of composure and patience with myself, I found the reassignments section for I-42 housing registrants. Fortunately, it was alphabetized and I flicked through the large brown files of varying thickness. There were files here that dated from the inception of Moya as an independent nation, and in a less tense situation, I might have enjoyed the walk through history, scanning the lives of others. As it was, though, I had not the time nor the ability to relax. I jumped to B and flicked down to find Briar Lloyd. The existence of the record meant that he had been reassigned at some point at least, but that was true of most people at one time or other in their lives. I tossed the file out onto the floor and at the same time took down the file next to it labelled Briar Mark, dropping it down to the floor next to the first. Crouching down and with torch in hand, I looked first at Lloyd's file. Contrary to popular rumour, the paperwork inside all but confirmed he had never left I-42 and certainly never been assigned out of sector. His record showed him moving several times as a child, first from the housing district by my motel, and then I assumed after the death of his father, Peter, he moved 3 times within this side of the district, which, whilst being somewhat unusual for a non-ministry textiles worker, it wasn't anything that let out alarm bells. There was no paperwork that alluded to any reassignments to an ex-sector. He was, for all intents and purposes, or officially speaking at least, living just a 10-minute walk from the register office and working in a textiles factory in between here and the housing district. Mark Breyer's file was almost identical. The only sidestep was at the age of 21 when, presumably after he took his role in the ministry, he was moved further up the district. I recognised the area to be very close to the centre of the district though, and it did strike me as curious that at such a young age he was assigned a house so close to the centre. This was prime real estate in the Moya way of things. Once again though, it told me little else. I-42 was not a large sector, and it was perhaps just the first available plot. Maybe the boy just got lucky. I felt deflated. I had not learnt much at all, though I had at least confirmed that Lloyd was never in the next sector, as Marshall had told me earlier on the phone. But I was no closer to the bigger mystery as to where he had been. Clearly, wherever it was not in a house 3 blocks from where I sat. I flicked through the shelving again and found Milton, Robbie. Robbie had, it seemed, a much less turbulent housing situation. He had always lived on this side of the sector in a house with his parents who, judging by their ministry careers, had not moved once from the administerial district since giving birth to Robbie and his older brother. He moved into a smaller house again, presumably when he took the job in the register office. I slid the files back into their correct positions on the shelf and stretched my back. So what now? I decided to look through the birth and death records for the sector to see if I could find any certificate for Peter's death. I quickly found both his and Mark's, standing next to each other on the shelf. The crisp card of Mark's file was a glaring contrast to his grandfather's, which had shrunk at the corners and become soft and pliable with age. Sitting on the shelf directly next to Mark's was that of another Breyer, however. Again, the file was crisp and looked new. The label was written in neat biro handwriting. Breyer, Sandra. I tossed all 3 onto the ground and flicked first through Peter's. The obituary's description of unexpected was, as I had suspected, a rather large understatement. His death certificate marked cause of death as hypothermia, though the autopsy report made grim reading that belied any sort of natural exposure. Among the hair of the deceased are particles of moss and pine needles. Hair is burned on the right side of the head, hemorrhages in the temporalis muscles, with minor brown and reddish abrasions on the forehead. Scratches of approximately 1.5 centimeters long across the face, and brownish red bruising on the upper right eyelid with hemorrhage into the underlying tissues. Traces of blood discharge from the nose with swelling and clusters of small abrasions on both sides of the face. Large fracture to the frontal bone 6 by 1 centimeter in length. A death that would have been, it's fairly safe to say, quite unexpected. It sounded as though the man had been bludgeoned to death, not simply frozen. I flipped open the new-looking file for Mark Breyer and found a similar story, though this time there were no autopsy reports accompanying the death certificate. Cause of death had been recorded as acute bacterial pneumonia, though I had heard the description from Alfred and seen the boy's body myself. The certificate had been signed off by our very own Dr. Pallardi. I turned to the 3rd Breyer file and flipped it open, by now completely unsure of what to find and whether or not I could believe anything that it recorded anyway. Sandra Breyer was 2 years old at the time of death, and apparently, which was news to me as no one had yet seen fit to mention, Mark Breyer's daughter. Again, there was no autopsy report, though her death was marked bilateral bronchopneumonia due to chronic asthma. It was once again signed off by Palardi. Why had no one mentioned this to me before? She had died just 2 months before the murder of her mother and father. Surely Ashbridge would have felt this information important to the investigation. I placed the files back on the shelf and flicked the beam of the flashlight across them, cascading the light across each edge. I was about to give up and accept that I had, at least, confirmed the status of Lloyd Breyer, when I noticed that, curiously, there was an abundance of more recent-looking files. Upon first noticing this, I gave it little consideration, but then I stopped myself. In Moya, the Black Decade took a heavy toll on the population. If one were to visit a register in any sector, this would, I presume, be reflected in the death certificates and files. And yet here, in I-42, it was almost like the Black Decade had struck 15 years later. I began flicking through the more recent-looking files. Some were as expected: old age, work-related accidents. But there was a grim ratio that grew with each file. More and more were newborns or children of a very young age, an entirely disproportionate amount. Either the people of I-42 were careless in their upbringing, or something stranger was going on here. One after the other I pulled the files down. 2 years old, cardiovascular complications. 3 years old, cardiac standstill. 1 year old, congestive heart failure. All of them signed off by Palardi. I pulled down more random files one at a time. The same story arose until one file in particular drew my attention. There was a file marked Milton, Michael. As I read through the certificate of birth and death, I gleaned that Michael Milton was Robbie's younger brother. The age difference considerable, and I was shocked that his parents would have considered having a new child with their careers entering their twilight years. He was just a few months old at the time of his death, which was, as far as I could tell, just 6 months prior. His cause of death was influenza leading to pneumonia, and was signed off by Palardi again. The register for the death was Robbie himself. Palardi, I thought to myself, you have a lot to answer for. There was a loud crack from outside, and I dropped the files on the floor as I made to turn off the torch. I sat in the pitch black of the office. With the lights out, the silence became thick and heavy. I felt a jolt of panic as I realised I had left my toolkit laid out on the stark white snow. I cursed myself for the stupidity and then sat in the silence and listened. Nothing. I sat for several minutes, my hearing strained for the slightest sound, but all had fallen quiet again, and it didn't sound as if anyone was out in any of the yards. I tentatively flicked the torch back on and quickly gathered the files from the floor, stuffing them back onto the shelving. It was time to get out of here. I bent down to collect the file from Milton, Michael, and as I gathered and squared them into a neat pile, I noticed on the back of the certificate was handwriting. I shone the torch onto it as I lifted it to take a closer look and read just 3 words scribbled in pencil. Please forgive me. I stuffed the certificate inside my coat and placed the empty file back on the shelf, flicked off the torch and made my way back to the yard. My toolkit sat on the ground as I had left it, now partially covered with fresh snow which had begun to fall heavily again. I wrapped it back up quickly, crouched by the wall and shuffled back to the gate, hopping over it with a reverberating clang, and walked hastily to the car. It wasn't until I was halfway back to the motel that my heart stopped beating through my chest. I lay in bed trying to process all that I'd gathered from the evening's excursion, but found it more and more difficult to untangle as my eyelids dropped heavily. The snow had returned to a heavy fall again, and driving home had taken every last ounce of my concentration to see past the whipping white flakes as they flitted around in the darkness, illuminated by headlights and obscuring the dark night ahead. Sophie sat by the small desk in the motel room. "How does it feel to be stuck out here, James?" she asked me. "Not great. I want to go home." "Me too, James. Me too." Moya was created by Ben Cutmore. Intro and outro music is used under Creative Commons Attribution License and is called Russian Winter by Tim from tabletopaudio.com. You can help support the show by heading over to patreon.com/Moya podcast, and as thanks you gain access to a private Discord server as well as early access to episodes and all that other good stuff. Thanks for listening.